and philosophy. And of course, with Dr. Johnson from Tennessee State University is Professor Sheila, Professor Sheila Smith-McKoy, M-C-K-O-Y. Dr. McKoy from Vanderbilt University, the Department of English. And of course, let me welcome both of you to the show this morning to talk about what I consider to be a very, very important topic, the Harlem Renaissance. But before we get into that, let's have you, Dr. Johnson, to start us off by giving us some information about your background, your education, and some of your experiences. And of course, Dr. Smith-McKoy will give us the same kind of, similar kind of information, and then we'll get into the Harlem Renaissance itself. Let's start off with you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Dr. Haney. Of course, I've been here before, so you know that I am a Tennessee State University graduate. I have a Bachelor of Arts in English from Tennessee State University, a Master of Arts in English from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and a PhD in English from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. I've taught at Tennessee State University now. I began there about 27 years ago, and I have taught freshman English, world literature, women in literature, and recently I've been teaching a lot of the African American literature courses, particularly the graduate course in the early part of the African American literature, and the I taught a course in the Harlem Renaissance last semester. So.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Sheila Smith-McKoy, let's have some information about your background, your education, some of your experiences, and et cetera.
Okay. I did my undergraduate degree at North Carolina State University. Got the master's from UNC Chapel Hill, and I followed with the PhD from Duke University. And this job at Vanderbilt that I currently hold, I'm an assistant professor of English, and right now I currently am the acting director of the African American Studies program. Like Gloria, I've taught a variety of courses. I have a standing course on the Harlem Renaissance where we look at visibility and aesthetics of the period, and the students grapple with the ideas that the Harlem Renaissance writers tried to come to grips with during that period of time. But I also teach a variety of courses in American literature, African American literature, African literature, and Afro-Caribbean literature.
Very good. I think we've got the making of an excellent show here dealing with the Harlem Renaissance. Let's start it off, Dr. Johnson, by having you to sort of define what we really mean by the Harlem Renaissance and the part that event plays in terms of the African-American experience, or indeed the American experience. And of course, the two of you will simply deal with that kind of information for us.
Okay. The Harlem Renaissance is basically the first major black cultural movement in the United States. The Renaissance came about after around 1920, 1917. It's been dated at different times. We like to say it took place in about a full decade, but many writers tend to move that further. So roughly we're looking at a period between roughly 1917 and 1935, where there was quite a bit of production in terms of art and other cultural activities in the United States. The name Harlem Renaissance comes from two ideas. First, the idea of Harlem, because New York and the area of Harlem was the center of much of the activity. But the Renaissance in general took place throughout the United States, so it takes in other people, and many of the writers were from many other places. In fact, some writers have pointed out that only one of the Renaissance writers was actually born and lived in New York. All of the others came from other places because they knew about the activity and the excitement that was going on. The idea of Renaissance, of course, we know it as a rebirth, and many critics have said it can't be a rebirth if there never was any literature. On the other hand, there had been writers long before the Renaissance, what we consider precursors of the Renaissance, and one of the things that that rebirth stood for was a kind of coming together of a lot of the writers. This was one of the first times that a lot of African-American writers had been able to collaborate with each other and talk about ideas together. Some of the others had known each other before and had corresponded. We know about that. But we don't know that they actually came together and wrote things or participated in some of the kind of activities that the writers of the Harlem Renaissance did.
Very good. Dr. Smith-McKoy, she mentioned the forerunners of the so-called Harlem Renaissance. Let's have you, from your literature experiences and et cetera, let's have you to give us a few words in reference to that group and what that was all about.
Okay. The forerunners to the Renaissance actually began with the beginning of African American literary expression in the slave narratives. And even before that, Our Nig was published in 1858. We also had African Americans publishing in London prior to that time, so that we had a movement in the slave narrative that like the Harlem Renaissance, was sort of a multi-ethnic Renaissance and movement, because there were various constituencies involved. You also had sort of the neo-slave narratives following that, and outstanding writers who wrote in local color genres, such as Charles Chesnutt, Alice Dunbar Nelson, who came up prior to the Renaissance. In fact, Charles Chesnutt's last novel, Colonel's Dream, was published in 1906, and that was the last novel that was published prior to the novels of the Harlem Renaissance and African American literary expression. The last poet that was published prior to that was Paul Dunbar Nelson, who published last around 1906 as well. And the next poet was not published until the Harlem Renaissance. So, like Gloria said, it's a movement that was very self-reflexive, and it was a movement that involved people from all over the United States as well as from abroad. Eric Warren was from the Caribbean, as was Claude McKay, a Jamaican by birth, so that we had lots of people sort of focusing not only on the United States, but on Harlem as the center of this activity. And it was also multi-ethnic in a way, because many of the Harlem Renaissance writers had support from outside of the black community, not only as personal mentors, but also the patronage system was in place. And lots of the writers published in journals that were wholly dedicated prior to that to literature that was produced by white Americans. And so the focus of the United States was really on black writers at this period of time. It was an idea whose time had come, which made it all the more important.
And so this cultural movement had its roots really in the slavery system. Would that be a correct assessment? And to say that it was sort of reflected in the census, as I would imagine, of the 1920 during that period. Would that be a correct assessment, and did that have any impact upon
well,
the
yes
movement
and
toward?
no. A part of the movement was geared towards the idea that the beginning of African American consciousness was not slavery. It went beyond that. So many of the Harlem Renaissance writers look back to Mother Africa and sort of cast Africa and African experience in a more positive light to reflect a movement beyond the slavery and the bondage of African Americans. And it was also a really revolutionary movement. 1919 Red Summer, I believe there were about 26 riots that took place all over the country. And it was a time in which you had young men coming back from the war, having fought for America, and were looking for their own rights. So there really was a new Negro in town, if you will, for the Harlem Renaissance.
As a matter of fact, this phrase became connected with the entire movement. What was that phrase, Dr. Johnson?
Very
How
much
do you
so,
explain?
the new Negro, the idea of a whole new person. And that was one who also came out of, it was kind of rebuking the kinds of things that had gone on in slavery and in the Reconstruction period, that period after slavery, when there was quite a bit of violence and a number of rights that blacks had attained after the war were taken away again. So those kinds of things were actually being, the new Negro brought about an idea of doing away with all of that and starting a new person, a new idea.
An entirely different race consciousness in terms of who the African American at that time. Of course, I think that, again, as we enter our first commercial break, and I don't want to raise another question that would interrupt that, but I will say that it was sort of not only a new consciousness, but it was recognition that the African did have a history. I think, as you've already indicated, Dr. Smith-McKoy, that the African did have a history, and they wanted to glorify and raise up that history. And of course, we'll stop now for our first commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this short commercial break. The Harlem Renaissance